Hello everyone and welcome to your prep screencast for chapter 28, which will be on pregnancy and human development. So let's get started. First I want to define a few terms for you. Pregnancy is going to be when fertilization occurs until the infant is born. Forgot I had pictures along here. The conceptus is going to be the developing offspring, and this could be an embryo, it could be a fetus. In general, we're going to call it the conceptus. Gestation period is going to be from the time that lasts from the last menstrual period until birth. And an embryo will be from the conceptus from fertilization through week 8. Okay, so here I have a picture of an embryo for you. And then, and this is at the level of week 8, of course. And then we have the fetus, which will be the conceptus from week 9 until the baby is born. So let's continue on. Here's our fertilization, how tiny it is, into a 3-week embryo, or 1-week conceptus, and then 3-week embryo, 5-week embryo, 8-week embryo, which is when we stop calling it an embryo, and it now is a fetus at 12 weeks as well, until the baby is born. So from egg into a zygote. So what's happening here is, let's review a little bit. We got our secondary oocyte that was released in ovulation, and we have that oocyte right over here with the nucleus with all that great DNA on the inside, and surrounding it we have something called a zona pellucida that's protecting it, has some sperm receptors there for us, and then surrounding that we have those granulosa cells that are now called the corona radiata. And this oocyte traveling from the release from the ovary into the fallopian tube, this oocyte is viable for 12 to 24 hours. So that sperm has that window between one total day to fertilize it. Sperm is going to be viable a little bit longer. In your book it says from 24 to 48 hours, but it can last from 3 to 5 days as well. So that's what we're seeing in research right now, after ejaculation, of course. And sometimes we're going to see twins happen. So what does that mean? Well, if we have identical or monozygotic twins, that can result at the 2-cell state when one zygote splits and forms 2 embryos. Now, they're not exactly sure why this happens, how it happens, but this 2-cell state can last from 1 to 3 days. And here we go. This is the picture I want. And when we have a fraternal or dizygotic twins, that means it can result from 2 eggs being released at the same time, and they both get fertilized from 2 separate sperm cells. Okay, so let's continue on. What's happening during fertilization? Basically, the sperm that has the genetic information, the DNA within its head, is being released into the egg and combining with the DNA information inside the egg. So we're adding 23 chromosomes from the mother, 23 chromosomes from the father, and we get a diploid zygote now. And that's when fertilization has occurred. I'm going to talk more about how the sperm takes its journey through the vagina and what's kind of keeping or killing the sperm, really, because we have millions of sperm that are trying to enter and cause fertilization, but only about a dozen make it all the way up into the fallopian tube. So these little sperm guys have now traveled up the vagina, here's our cervix, into the uterus, they're traveling up to the fallopian tube, and right there in the ampulla is where they're running into the egg and going to cause fertilization. Okay, so what does it do when it gets up there? Well, we're going to have a couple sperm cells get there, and they're trying to make way through the corona radiata, through these granulosa cells. So some are going to kind of pave the way for some of the other sperm cells. And, oh, I forgot I have little labels for these. I'll just put these up if you guys want to read through. Okay, and then once they get through that granulosa layer, they now have another layer to get through, and that's that zona pellucida. And so they kind of use their acrosomal enzymes here to kind of move through the zona pellucida, and we can see this further along here. Then we can enter the receptors that are found within our plasma membrane of the oocyte. And that's when we're going to have an opening of calcium channels, okay? The calcium channels opening up are going to trigger, I really can't talk today. I feel like I can't talk any day, but anyway, it's going to trigger a cortical reaction. So now we have exocytosis of cortical granules. And what's that going to do is harden our zona pellucida throughout the rest of the oocyte here and block other sperm from entering into the egg. So that one winner that got through, that's the only sperm whose nucleus is going to enter in and fuse with the egg's genetic information. Okay, and that's what we're seeing here. That sperm's nucleus is entering in. Both the sperm's nucleus as well as the, as well as the egg's nucleus are going to swell and enlarge, and then they're going to come together and form a mitotic spindle in order to really truly come together and fuse and become that diploid zygote. From there, we're going to go through a cleavage stage. What this means is we instantly are going to start to go through mitosis over and over and over again. And so 2 cells are going to become 4, 4 cells become 8, 8 cells become 16, 16 cells become 32, and then eventually we'll start to divide. I just want to mention that this 16th stage is called a morula, and it's named after a mulberry. So that's a fun little name, fun little tidbit. Anyway, we have the 32 stage cell also being called a morula, but really you have to reach that 16 stage first. Anyway, from there at day 3 to 4, we're going to start to get our embryo really taking place here, because now we have approximately 100 cells and we get a blastocyst that will develop. Okay, so that blastocyst, let me move past here. We're going to start to see a differentiating of 2 different cells. We have the inner cell mass, which you see in that light salmon color there. That's going to become the embryo itself, whereas that blastocyst, once we go through implantation, that's going to start to develop into the placenta in order to allow an exchange of nutrients and waste products and gases between the embryo, or the conceptus, I should say, and the mother. So here we are. Now we have our embryoblast, we're going to call it, which is the inner cell mass, and we have all those trophoblast cells. Did I? Yes, I did. I kept on calling these blastocysts. I meant to call this the trophoblast cells. Sorry, I don't want to confuse you. The trophoblast cells here surrounding this entire thing is a blastocyst. Okay, just want to make that clear. I can't remember what I said. Anyway, these trophoblasts are really important because they are going to start to secrete some hormones for us. They are going to start setting up the placenta once we get over to our endometrium. So let me kind of show you this in this greater schematic here. We had that secondary oocyte released from the ovary, and it's traveling through the fallopian tube. In the ampulla, those sperms start to enter. Well, we really want one to make it through, and we get fertilization to occur. That, as it's traveling, it's doing a lot of work. It's going through mitosis. And so all of these cells are dividing over and over again. And what we're going to do is divide. We want these cells to differentiate, and then they're going to start to develop on their own. So as we're moving through, they start to become that blastocyst, where we have that inner cell mass and also those trophoblast cells around the periphery. And they will find a nice little fluffy patch here in the endometrium, in the uterus, of course, within that stratum functionalis, the functional layer that would normally slough off during a woman's period. It's going to stay put because now we have fertilization occurring. And like I said, those trophoblasts are secreting hormones. One of the hormones that it's secreting is the human chorionic gonadotropin. And that is going to go up to the anterior pituitary gland and tell it to stop secreting FSH, stop secreting LH, because we've got fertilization that's occurring. We don't need follicle development to occur because we are going to grow a baby. All right, it's as simple as that. All right, let's move on. Implantation. Implantation is the term that we use to talk about this blastocyst embedding into the endometrium. So what's going on as far as the hormones? We already mentioned the human chorionic gonadotrophin is being released by those trophoblast cells, and then estrogen and progesterone are going to start to be secreted more and more and more as the pregnancy continues. And those estrogen and the progesterone are responsible for the morning sickness that happens and a bunch of other exciting, weird stuff that we're going to talk about toward the end of the lecture. So another thing we really need to touch on is placentation. And this is the formation of the placenta. It takes about 3 months in order to do this. We have a couple different tissues that need to come together here. So we have our embryonic tissues, and our mesoderm cells within the embryo are going to start to develop from that inner cell mass that we were talking about. And they're going to form a chorion and chorionic villi. Now I want to skip a little forward because I think these pictures are very confusing. I want you to get a nice little base for you before we jump into this confusing stuff. Actually, this one isn't too bad. Okay, so let's take a look at this here. We have, this is our maternal blood, okay? We're starting to form vessels moving in here. This is all coming from our embryo. And so we get chorionic villi, which are going to be spaces where we can have our embryonic veins and blood vessels kind of enmeshed with the maternal one. Now we don't have a crossing of blood from the mother to the baby. Instead, we have this barrier kind of set up, a specific permeable, I should say semi-permeable barrier, so that we don't mix any harmful toxins to the baby. Okay, and this is showing you the decidua basalis, and this is more of the maternal view of the placenta. Okay, so here we have the baby side, that chorionic villi, okay, with all of our blood vessels here. This is our endometrium from the mother, and this is the decidua basalis. Let me switch to this so you can kind of see this moving along. So we start to have it grow into, like I said, our little barrier here. They're little spaces in which they're going to diffuse through our respiratory gases, nutrients, and waste products. Okay, and I'll kind of draw this out in class to make it a little bit more apparent. But I do like this image that your book provides for you. I'm going to skip through to the 16-day-old embryo. Here are the chorionic villi. Once again, that's going to develop into the embryo's blood supply to exchange with the maternal blood supply, which is developing right over here. Here we have the mother's decidua capsularis. Now this is a little bit different. This is a part of our endometrium once again, and it's facing our implanted embryo. Careful not to mix this with the decidua basalis that's going to be surrounding the, well, not really surrounding. Let me start again. This is on the, well, here's the lumen of the uterus. So this is lining the it's the lining of the endometrium. That's a good way to describe it. And the decidua basalis, that's more embedded closer to that stratum basalis layer, which is why it's called the decidua basalis. So it's just different sides of the decidua on the endometrium. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, I'll re-explain it in class. Okay, so the placenta is really this entire thing here that is the sharing of our blood supply from the mother to the conceptus. They are going to pass nutrients, waste products, and gases. And it's a really important organ in pregnancy because we're going to have hormones being secreted from it. We're going to secrete human placental lactogen, which that is going to help the mother prepare for breastfeeding. We have the human chorionic thyrotropin and also relaxin. And I'm going to talk about these hormones individually in class. And also, it'll secrete estrogen and progesterone. Remember, we said for the first 3 months that corpus lucidum in our ovary stays intact instead of turning into the corpus albicans because we need it to secrete estrogen and progesterone until the placenta is formed, so the placenta can secrete these hormones for us. And this is the same picture. We're going to talk about some of the other things like the amniotic sac and the yolk sac in class. And here we have a 13-week fetus moving along just great. I forgot to mention too that during week 8 is when organogenesis is going to take place. It's starting the formation of the organs. So at this point, at 18, were we at 18 or 13? At 13 weeks, we've moved along. We've started to really develop some organs, although it's going to take the full term for the organs to be all completely viable. Even after birth, the digestive system is still forming and growing. We'll talk more about that in class too. There's so much detail that can go into this. Here's a nice little close-up of the placenta and the sharing of these blood vessels. Here we have our chorionic villus, which is essentially the space where we have all of these fetal capillaries to exchange with the mother. And we have on the other end here our maternal blood coming in of the placenta at the decidua basalis. Okay. All right, let's continue. So everything I've outlined here in purple, that's the maternal portion. Blue is going to be the fetus. All right, now we talked about how the cells that were going through mitosis, we were dividing, then we were differentiating, and this is the main phase of differentiation. We differentiate into 3 primitive tissues that all of our body organs are going to be derived from, and that's going to be our ectoderm, which will turn into our nervous system and our skin's epidermis. The endoderm, that'll turn into our epithelial lining of our digestive, respiratory, and urogenital systems, and our mesoderm, which is responsible for so much stuff, but just in general, we're going to say muscles and connective tissues. And our endoderm and ectoderm are considered our epithelia. We'll go into more detail in class on those. Now, the development of our fetal circulation, we're going to talk about the specific changes we have in our circulation system, cardiovascular system in class. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it here, but I did want to touch on what the umbilical cord contains, and that's going to be umbilical arteries. We have 2 of them in which they're going to have a high amount of carbon dioxide and other waste products carrying it away from the fetus to the placenta, and we have 1 umbilical vein. That's going to have high oxygen and nutrients. And the 3 vascular shunts we're going to talk about in class. One of them you already know about is going to be the foramen ovale in the heart, but more on that later. And then all of these are going to be occluded at birth. Okay, so what are the effects of pregnancy? Well, we of course are going to have lots of anatomical changes. Our uterus is going to go from the size of a fist up to a huge belly, very large, about carrying a usually 7-pound baby in there. It can cause lordosis, where we have a change in the curvature of the lumbar vertebrae there, changing our center of gravity. And this is because we have a weight gain of about almost 30 pounds in the anterior abdomen. We talked about the placenta secreting relaxin. Relaxin, I love the name of this hormone because it just relaxes all the joints, all the ligaments within the body, which is going to cause that pubic symphysis to be able to relax and open up a little bit while a woman is going through childbirth. Oh, there was lower doses where you see the change in the center of gravity. Sometimes I forget what pictures I put in here. All right, so this, I just wanted to show you the change in the uterus here, going from a normal size before pregnancy, and then how big it is at 4 months, 7 months, and then finally at 9 months, if the woman makes it there. That fundus, which was that top portion of the uterus, makes it all the way up to that xiphoid process, which is a part of the sternum. Placental hormones, I'm going to talk about this in class. Let's skip this for now. Changes in our GI tract. I mentioned how the high levels of estrogen and progesterone are causing morning sickness. A woman might also get heartburn and constipation due to the increase in hormones, and a change in our blood supply as well. Urinary system, we're going to have an increase in urine production. This is not only going to be due to the size of the uterus putting pressure on the urinary bladder, which is going to cause an urgency to go more often, but also because we're having an increase in the amount of blood within the woman's body, we're going to have to flood that through the kidneys, and we're going to put more water and waste products into the urine. Also, we can have stress incontinence, which can occur as the bladder is compressed by that uterus, like I mentioned earlier. We'll have a change in our respiratory system. Estrogens are going to cause nasal edema and congestion. Our tidal volume is going to increase. We might have some dyspnea later on in the pregnancy as well because of that extra pressure that's put onto the thoracic cavity from the uterus being so large and kind of squishing all of the abdominal organs up against the thoracic cavity, which I think I've mentioned in class before that I kind of went through in my pregnancy at the end stages. Okay, our cardiovascular system, we talked about how we're going to have an increase in blood volume. It could be up to 40% more blood. Pretty impressive. Our blood pressure and pulse is also going to rise. And we might have issues with our venous return from our lower limbs. So it can result in varicose veins where we have a damage of those valves and getting that blood back up. Last thing we're going to talk about is parturition, or giving birth to a baby. These laborious events are going to help move the infant from the uterus out into the world. So what happens? How do we have the initiation of labor? What happens first is we're going to get a secretion of cortisol. And let's see, how can we summarize this? We are going to have cortisol release. Well, actually, first let's talk about our estrogen and progesterone. Our estrogen and progesterone have been at pretty equal levels. What happens toward the end of pregnancy or closer to the due date is progesterone levels fall and estrogen stays high, and that's going to tell our adrenal glands to release cortisol. The increase in estrogen keeps increasing as we get more and more cortisol release. So it's kind of a interesting relationship, how they're going to kind of egg on each other. Our uterus is going to have its myometrium make more receptors for oxytocin to attach. And oxytocin, if you remember back to our endocrine lecture, that is going to cause uterine contractions. See how this is all linked together? It really is amazing. Okay, so this is going to maybe cause some Braxton Hicks, which are known as false contractions, but it can help to lead into the actual contractions for the woman to go into labor. So what else is going on? Before I jump into the maternal, emotional, and physical stress, let's continue talking about some of the hormones being released. We talked about oxytocin already. The other thing estrogen is going to do is increase the gap junctions within the smooth muscle so that when our contractions do begin, the smooth muscle and the myometrium, it's all going to contract all together in order to push the baby together. Of course, starting up toward the fundus and moving down toward the cervix because we want to get a movement down instead of up. The fetus itself is also going to secrete oxytocin, and that will in turn, this is what we're seeing here, that will in turn tell the placenta to make prostaglandins. Prostaglandins also cause contractions, but they can use a positive feedback loop to cause more secretion of oxytocin. And so these contractions are going to get stronger and stronger until we get dilation to occur. All right, so here's dilation. The cervix of the uterus is going to start to open up. It's going to get to almost 10 centimeters wide, okay, in diameter. And what else do we need to mention here? The head of the baby hitting the cervix is going to cause the cervix to thin and dilate even more. That's going to lead us to, so here we see it open at almost 10 centimeters. Yikes, right? A little scary. And then we're going to have the expulsion stage. So now we have very strong contractions happening every 2 to 3 minutes, about a minute long. And a woman is going to start to feel the urge to push even more until that baby comes out. So we get a crowning that occurs when the largest dimension of the head is descending out of the uvula. That's that external genitalia of the female. And the head is going to be visible through the vaginal opening. And then we get delivery of the infant. So here we have expulsion taking place. That baby looks so happy, just not even nervous. Now, something that some of you might not know is that's not the end. A woman also still has to have uterine contractions in order to basically give labor to the placenta. So it detaches from the uterine wall and will move out the vagina as well. So that is our prep screencast. Jesus, I always try and make these 15 minutes and it always ends up being almost half an hour. If you have any questions before class, please let me know.